Okay, nagdebate sa kesti. Kumaw ka todo. Kesti live stream. Oh, hunggan enigi. Okay, pipa. Half a day todo samzu gwana hudzung. Estigi un otro episode Fanachu. Half a day to everyone out there who is watching or listening. This is another episode of Fanachu. Guahui host midzu tatlu para estina episode. Inanu si Michael Luhan Babakwa. And I am very excited to have with me a scholar who I look up to, whose work has sort of shaped and also sometimes corrected my own sort of thinking on a lot of issues in Guam history. And so I have with me here today Dr. Taitano Delisle, Chamoru feminist scholar, historian, indigenous studies scholar. Her work is essential for anyone who wants to understand the pre-World War II period. And sometimes people say who want to understand sort of the experiences of pre-World War II Chamoru women, but in truth, her scholarship is essential for understanding life in general. Because oftentimes, as her and Hattori and others have pointed out, the writing of Guam history, the historiography itself, even written by Chamorros, can be very androcentric, very male-dominated, can focus sort of on the male as the subject of history. And then the woman is always kind of in the background, even if the woman is celebrated as the Nana, as the Biha, as the Tetsa, always sort of in the background of that. And so Tina's work is so important. And I was so excited that her book has been published. And so she's here with us today for Fanachu. And so if you have any questions for her, put favor, type them in the comments, send them to me on WhatsApp. Sidzus masitalu perifinatomu Tina half a day.
Dr. Sidzus Masi Miguel para esta oportunidad. I'm really excited to be here. I should also say, can kind of think of it, I guess, as a form of tensuli, scholarly tensuli. If you have learned something from my work, I have learned much from your work and have drawn from your work, especially in thinking more recently about centering Manyetlu relationships in early Chamorro society.
Hey, Hagomas. And so, let's get started. Give us sort of your scholarly background for people. So many Chamorros in academia, of course, are very aware of your work. People who are close to the Taitano, the Kwetu clan, of course, are very familiar with this very Gofmatua na membro ni Familian Midzu. And so we've already got some messages coming in saying Linda Taitano Regis is saying, hey, Biba Tina. And so give us a sense of your scholarly background for people who aren't familiar with your work. Put favor.
Yes, so it's actually I did my undergrad at Berkeley, and I actually surprisingly, many people might be surprised to know that I was actually a biology major my first 2 years. So a lot of this stuff that when I think about health and the placenta, it brings me back to those days. And then I went on to came back home and got involved with a very important, very pivotal project for me, which was the Heletta series. And then I realized that I wanted to do graduate work, and I took undergraduate work at the University of Guam. So I'm a UOG alum, and did a master's in Micronesian studies, which is where I really focused on the work of the Patera. And it was really through the work, through the MA thesis, that I began to look at the entanglement of the work between Navy wives and Chamorro women. And so I decided to pick up that topic as a dissertation topic, got into a program, a PhD program in history and women's studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And that's where I looked at the new dimension there was looking at Navy wives, but also with a feminist analysis. That's where I really began to hone my feminist analysis of history, and um, looking more at the power relations between Chamorro women and Navy wives under U.S. colonialism. So it's not. I consider the book, not simply not just a women's history. It certainly is, and it's first and foremost. I like to think of it as a Chamorro women's history, but a very complex history of Chamorro women. So not simply, well, in a way, elevating to a different kind of analysis, right? Where Chamorro women were simply succumbing to the Navy's ways, but they were really working these intricate spaces of colonialism, and in particular in relation to the work, the gendered labor of Navy wives who considered that work philanthropy, charitable work. And then that work, of course, was also very gendered in terms of the kind of spaces that women were allowed to enter in particular education and nursing. And that was also that reflected the broader gendered spaces in the US.
Again. Oh, yes. And so
course, was also very gendered in terms of
can you hear me?
the kind
Oh,
of
shoot,
spaces
sorry.
that women were allowed to enter in.
Oh, sorry, dispensa. Oh, thank you, Sidus Masi, for that background. And I really do want to actually thank you and your partner, Dr. Vince Diaz, Puritsetsu Mizunai, on the Heletta series. Thank you for bringing that up. You know, I always tell people that if you really like, people always say, you know, there's nothing out there. And I always say, no, Timo Gahedanal, work has been done. And important work has been done. The important thing is not to just say that there's nothing out there, but to look what has been done and then find out, are there gaps? Can we build on what has been done? And the first Heletta, the first volume of the Heletta series, Who's Who in Chamorro History, Imam Fadzi, right? That is a seminal sort of work in terms of bringing historical figures where there might be like a street named after them, but nobody knew who this person was, sort of after World War II, or even just expanding the lens for what we think of as being a historically significant contribution, right? Because you look at Carano and Sanchez, and you even look at Sanchez himself in Guam Guahan, and you even look at somebody like Destiny's land, you know, Robert Rogers' Destiny's Landfall, and it's really governors, senators, generals, priests. And so the history really is always sort of the people that sort of the colonial system has determined that these are of value, and then which sort of these imported systems of life determine that these are the important people. But what I loved about the Heletta series was that it included Tetsas, you know, and it included we just had on island for the immersion camp one of the sons of Tun Jesus White, you know, who was included in it. There's Tetsas, there was educators, there was massacre survivors, you know, and it was and even it even included sort of the wife of Masong Song, sort of
right.
yeah. So it had all of these figures that you wouldn't normally see as being important, but there was a biography. And so I wanted to actually hear more about sort of how did that come about, the Heletta series, the Imam Fadzi series in particular.
So, you know, for some people who don't know this, it was a public mandated Gov Guam mandate. And what I really loved about it, it had a board. I had the good fortune of working very closely. In fact, I consider Dr. Catherine Egan to be a mentor. She took me under her wing, and there was a board with comprised mainly of educators, and they would change from time to time. But I had the good fortune of working with. This is actually where I met Robert Underwood, who had a big hand in the establishment of the commission early on, and um, um, Hope Cristobal, and got to work closely with the writer Kathy Galt. She was working alongside. Kathy wasn't on the board, but I worked very closely with her. She was served as the editor. Um, the late Dr. John Solis. Just a number of the late Tony Palomo. So I really had those, to me, were the best times. It's actually also where I met my partner, who served as the resident historian for the Heletta series, or the historian. I tease him. I'm like, the resident historian. Um, and those to me were some of the best times. And I often get nostalgic because that's where you hear all the stories, some of the oral histories that some of these educators, scholars, teachers, they had done on their own. I also got to know some of the contributors to the Heletta series, and I always knew of Dr. Anne Hattori, and she was one of the contributors to one of the books that came out, and I got to meet some of the other the late Senator Pilar Lujan, just so many people who I had the opportunity to just sit around during our monthly meetings, and we just talked story. And I was just like, I felt like this wet sponge, really taking in all these the knowledge and stories about pre-World War II stories. And this is where the decision, it was very difficult, the decision of who I should go out and interview. These were conversations that we had collectively, and the board, and we would all sit around and talk about who would be really worthwhile, what families I should approach. As I actually wrote a piece on your grandfather, to Jack Lujan, and had a really wonderful time sitting down and chatting with him. So many other people, to Segundo Blas.
Hungen, oh my goodness. I think I'm trying to think. I think almost every single person now has passed away who was featured in that first volume of Iman Fadzi. I think I'm trying to think if there's anyone. I'm gonna actually take a look at it in a second. But so I wanted to I'm wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit more about this approach to history, because historians, they're, and what's always fascinating to me is that there's always this feeling amongst the community too that kind of trickles down from academia, right? That it has to be written down for it to matter. Only if it was written down is it valuable, or is it true, or is it real? And I find that to be kind of funny then in the world in which people basically make up their own truths on social media about who won an election or about what the shape of the world is. But thinking then about how in the past, sort of, historians have felt that they need to stick very strongly to archives, written sources in that traditional sense, but then missing then sort of orality, community knowledge, sort of, and those sorts of things. And that was one thing that I really liked about that Imam Fadzi, is that it was informed by the archival, by the historical, but that it also clearly used family stories, things that have been passed down within the family as well. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about that as a historian, who teaches indigenous studies, who tackles these issues. Because one thing that I always push back against is even Chamorros who feel like sort of that what a Navy governor wrote down is more important than what your grandparents said, because one was written down and the other is told to you in a family context.
Yeah, that was something that the family stories is what got me really thinking. In addition to the Heletta project, but a lot of these stories, for examples that were shared with by the members of the board, the PSCC's board, were family histories. And one thing that it motivated me to do was to really go back and um, just take in a lot of the family histories. And this is where the stories about, I mean, nobody really, growing up, I never really heard about the patera. And it was only really through this project, the Heletta project, when you know uh Tony Palomo, I can't remember, I did say Tony Palomo, right? Not Tony Ramirez. I actually did work very closely with the late Tony Ramirez at the museum as well on another project. But Tony Palomo would talk about, they a lot of times they went around the room, Kon Hasu Edu, did you ever remember the midwife who was known for driving a Jeep, right after the war? Um, I know that, and so other, what, people that they considered to be these heroes and heroines. And the book that I was assigned to was really this compilation of biographies to give our youth examples of, tomorrow heroes and heroines. Um, and and so look, thinking about family histories, I also loved, one of my favorite places at Mark was the vertical files. um Now I know it really depends on who's cutting out who's doing the clippings, right? But I always found those to be really fascinating. Just little stories that would not make it into the big picture stories. So I spent a lot of time there. I I also think, as a historian, we it's really good to get into the archives, because there's a lot of gems in there. And an example of one of those gems to me is when I was doing archival work at the National Archives in San Bruno, and it was in a miscellaneous folder, and it was a it was like a 4-page document that was essentially like a list of the registered vehicles. And out of the 100 names, there's only one woman on there, and that's Tembari Dogi. And and that really shows, I think it shows under the Navy how, women's mobility was really restricted, and not just by the Navy, but we have to take into consideration the very staunch Catholic costumbre in Chamorro, that unless I mean, if you were single, young, and unless you were going to church, were part of the sodality of Mary, you had no business really going out, right? Especially under the naval period. But those kind of treasures, archival sources, really help you to to interpret the past in a very different way.
Hungen, no, thank you for bringing up sort of that historical context, though, for a Chamorro woman sort of in the pre-war, immediate post-war space. Because for me, that was something when I was a grad student, like I wasn't appreciative as in the way that I should have been. And that's why sort of your work, and I remember you presenting with, I think her name's Karen Fury Cruz. I remember watching you present at UOG sort of about the patera, and then it really shifted initially, and then sort of when I read your thesis, it shifted more. When I read something that you had written about Agatha Johnston, it shifted more. And so it was good because, I was interviewing a lot of elders, trying to kind of just learn about their experiences. But then it was interesting because there was still sort of blinders in many people and how they would talk about it, to the complexity of the time, right? So, for example, I was interviewing people who would kind of talk about pateras or the nurses in kind of diminutive terms because they were women who were outside of their role, right? And
Mhm.
so in some ways then I absorbed that into the way that I saw things, right? So the way that I was thinking about that time for a while, because, so for example, like one of the things that I remember hearing about like Agatha Johnston is that some people whispering and saying, she would have our girls dance for the Marines. She would have she would take them and they have them dance, and that's wrong and stuff. And so I was thinking then like, oh my goodness, this is cultural erosion and loss of identity because of naval influence. But then I wasn't as appreciative of the fact that sort of for women in this context there was a lot more freedom. Potentially there was definitely sort of racism and paternalism from the US side, but there was also more agency and autonomy, right? That ability to sort of to explore the island more, to sort of have your own pay, to sort of have your own connections to people. You know, it was just so can you talk a little bit more about that? Because you mentioned it earlier, sort of that Chamorro women at that time were in a way they were sort of trapped on the one end from the US Navy, which on the one hand presented some opportunities, but also was very sexist, racist, paternalistic. And then their own families, which at the same time could be very dismissive, controlling in terms of their own ability to keep them within sort of the perceived culture at the time.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that I really learned about the Heletta project. The Heletta project was something that I consider to be a really an example of decolonizing history, really centering Chamorro histories, Chamorro culture. One of the things that I felt like, I don't want to say it didn't do enough of, because I think that wasn't the project. The project was to really to elevate Chamorros and to give to definitely educate the youth. And this was all in the context of the political status, um, the self-determination struggles, right? So for Chamorros to be and the island to be really knowledgeable about that past. The focus was on Chamorro history from a Chamorro perspective. And one of the things that became evident to me was the complexity of these stories. Um, if anyone reading Heletta would say they're mostly good stories and they're feel good stories, and that's true, you know. But there is another side to these histories, these very complex histories, and that's what I wanted to also analyze in the graduate work, in the master's thesis, but also the dissertation. So it wasn't simply colonialism. And I always tell this story of how when I was writing the master's thesis, it was all about bad colonialism, usurping women's powers, trying to replace Chamorro culture and Chamorro ways of knowing and Chamorro forms of health, the fabric of Chamorro society and Costumbre Chamorro and so forth. Um, but there's more dynamic history to tell. And I mean, yes, colonialism was bad, but it was also looking at how Chamorros were inscribed in the project, how Chamorros were interpolated or brought into it, and how they might have also been even at times complicit, wittingly or unwittingly. And this to me was really important, not just for the sake of showing a more complex history, but in terms of the bigger project of sovereignty and decolonization. And we need to look back at history and and how were we negotiating the colonialism? How were we complicit? How might we have been complicit, if albeit unwittingly, right? Um, so looking at that in analyzing that in a more dynamic way. Some of the stories that that I remember writing in the Heletta were very, one could, they could be construed as romanticizing Chamorro culture, right? Or they could be seen as hagiographic, really just elevating and making people look saint-like. So I definitely wanted to do more with with the other studies under in the masters, and then in the dissertation, but then at the book in the book, um, and one that was really very conscientious about how these histories could inform decolonization struggles.
Hongen, I definitely think that that your work has absolutely informed it, because it's, what I find is that the less we know about our history, the more that we accept sort of a colonial sort of version of our history, sort of the less empowered we feel, right? Because the colonizer, part of their ultimate message, right, is that you don't matter. Everything that matters, I will give you, right? And your role is to give things up, right? And your role is to accept the things that I have. And so it's hard to decolonize in a space in which people may not feel like their history matters, their culture matters, their language isn't important, right? So in a sense, that's that nationalist project, right? That a decolonial nationalist project is that you need to feel like you have something that grounds you, that 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 sort of cannot be accounted for completely within sort of colonization. Oh, hey, Biba, perfect timing. Guess what just got dropped off? Biba.
That's
But
great.
but Hungen, and so actually I wanted to, we have E Sidus Masi Senora Chris, Fanachu patron on Patreon. She says, Senzahu, this is a Senora Chris Carbazido. She says, Senzahu ileblun Senora Delisle, who has susitankina, Tiahud Zenibisinun Mami Gidzahaged. Oh, her aunt and her relative in Agad. Guina Champo Zahu Mekungo Zakumekuntus Guids and Sinanahu Zahu Naina Hutungu Yastorianya Pagu. She says that she is so grateful that you gave the Patera space in your book, because I think what Senora Chris is talking about is something you were alluding to earlier, right? Is that there's these figures that may be important in our family life, in our village life, especially for people who are older, right? There's the Surahana, there's the Patera, there's maybe the Tetsa, but you may not know much about them, but they were an essential part of your life, right? And that your work for particular women figures and sort of the figure in general gives a loving, critical, nuanced perspective. And in the case of people such as Tankina, is that Tankina that's Babauta, Herrera, Hungan, it puts the, it tells their story. And so did you want to respond to Senora Chris and her gratitude?
So relations, no, with Tankina is so a little bit was cut off, but Senora, the relationship sweaty how, because Tankina is knowing Tankina, I mean, I spent more than once interviewing her, several, I spent about 3 or 4 times, long interviews. I loved it. She never gave a straightforward answer. She was always, taking me to one story, and then she'd come around and very profoundly just kind of hammer it home, so Tankina is a really good example, because as you were talking before you read that, we're reading the chat and Senora Chris's comment, and thank you so much for that, Senora Chris. You were talking about history and the problems of history, but it reminded me of last week's the episode with Monica, and one of the comments had to do with being too presentist. And I think what's really, I think when we rush to say something's too presentist, because we're not simply saying that there were queer Chamorros or there were feminists. We're doing something we're doing something more here, and I think we're being more thoughtful here, and we're careful not to be ahistorical, which is we're trying to really read things in the past. And Tankina is a good example. The way that she articulated how she cared for women, I always think about that as an example. We wouldn't have called it birth work back then, but to me, this is an example of what we would now call indigenous birth work, and really what it means to provide care to families, not just the expecting mother, but to look out for the well-being of Chamorro families. And so it encompasses much more than simply delivering the babies. So that term birth work, and of course, birth work now means it means now having what they might call your doula, someone who's there by you at your side, when in pre-war times, patera were essentially the doula of today.
No, c'est doucement, c'est doucement. And again, I'm wondering the where you have talked about sort of the placenta, sort of, and the role of the afterbirth, right? And that is something that has, when I first read it, when I first heard about it, it always struck me in a profound way. And I think that even though this is something that was, very common before World War II, this is something that kind of leaves our imagination and our knowledge quite quickly. So, for example, I as you may know, but others may not be familiar, I tried to keep the afterbirth for my kids when they were born. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I found is, even talking to older nurses who had been around since like the 70s or the 60s, they said they had never heard of anybody like at GMH asking for the afterbirth before. And so I'm wondering, can you talk about sort of that cultural practice? Just because when I talk to people now about it, people are surprised. They've never heard of it before. And I'm like, dude, your parents knew about this. Your grandparents practiced it. How is it that so quickly something like this, which was a very important cultural practice, kind of disappears? And so if you don't mind just talking about the afterbirth sort of custom.
So what I've learned, and it was really through the oral histories, and the first patera I remember having a conversation with about this was Tenliang Mesa, and she we were talking about something else, and then I explained to her, tell me, from the moment someone's pregnant, talk to me about that relationship, how you cared for the expecting mother. And it was a conversation, I believe, about prenatal care, and because it was emphasized that you had to the Navy was trying to get women to avail themselves to the Navy doctors, and so she was telling a story about how she would convince mothers to see the Navy doctor, and then from there she'd be able to go to the house and deliver the baby there where the women wanted to give birth. And then she proceeded to tell me, and then when I'm done, she even Tankina talked about this, as well as Tanon and Sabojas. Oh, I'd like to stay behind, and my transcripts, by the way, for these 15 to 20 pages, because they talk about, oh, I stayed behind, and the family, Fatina's kadunmanuk, that's the best form of payment I got for delivering babies. And then one of the things that we would do is make sure that we wrapped up the baby's placenta, and we would bury it in the papasaki, or we bury it right underneath the steps, or not far from the home. And so I immediately, that struck me, right? So I started to read up on that. I didn't see any references to that practice, except for in Laura Thompson's ethnography. And I just started to read up more on that as much as I could. And then I started to see that that was a practice that was very prevalent in other indigenous societies in Pacific Island culture. So it made sense. The one thing that was really conveyed was this practice was a way of safeguarding the baby. So this is the way that some of the patera described. And then when I went back and asked Tankina and Tanan and Sabodas, some of the other nurses, they would say, and some of the Surahanas, they say, Hungen, that's right. That's what used to happen. I remember reading a reference to it. Then I started to see the references to this practice, not a lot, but after I wrote the master's thesis, I saw a reference in Polly Eric Forbes' blog, that practice. And so what really came across was why people did it. It was to protect the child from childhood all the way into adulthood. And it was also about keeping the child rooted in place, according to Tan Liang. And what I really loved about Tan Liang's story was that when I asked her about this, I said, who taught you this, how did you learn about this? She said, it wasn't the Navy. I mean, she was really quick to say that. It wasn't the Navy. The Navy didn't teach us that. And she said, that's something I learned from my great aunt. And so, I realized that was going back generations. And again, it was really about conveying, you do this, and it was a way of protecting the child. But I can't help but think that it's also, when you think about how the placenta nourishes the baby and just what an amazing body organ tissue it is, that it's also, it may also be an example of not only representing the relationship between the mother and the child, or the patera and the mother, but also a relationship to the placenta. Caring for the placenta in a way. And even though people didn't articulate that, if I could go back and ask the questions, I would say, tell me a little bit more. I mean, this is about safeguarding the child from harm and protecting the child from harm. But what else was going in your mind, or what did you know about why you had to wrap it? I mean, some would wrap the placenta and then bury it. What was that about? And I really can't help but think that it was also about a relationship between Chamoros and the placenta.
No, amazing. It's just it's even you just describing sort of how your sense of this expanded through archival lit reviews, but also oral histories. That's really cool. I think one thing that I really liked about the way you described that there is, it's just a reminder that I think and I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I was talking to some people who are doing oral histories, and I'm like, there's a huge divide in pre-World War II sort of Manamku. If you went to school before 1922, your outlook was usually very different than if you went to school after 1922. And part of the big reason is because that education became more standardized in the 20s. Right.
That's
and
right.
So for example, before, Chamorro was prohibited before 1922, but some teachers used Chamorro and some teachers didn't care if their kids used Chamorro. The punishment was very inconsistent based on the schools and the teachers. But after 1922, it's standardized. Everyone pretty much gets punished for speaking Chamorro. And that's why I always say, if you got the chance to ask somebody who was born in the end of the 1800s about their experiences, it's very different than somebody born in the 20s and 30s. In the 20s and 30s, it's definitely a Chamorro life, but you can tell that they're already telling American-style bedtime stories to kids. Kids are influenced by things like they hear on the radio, right? So Like you're born in the 30s, you're listening to the Lone Ranger, you're talking about, who Tarzan is. So their world is definitely shifted. But if you got to talk to people who were born a little bit before that, you really get a sense of how, in some ways, there's these deep connections to nature, to the spirits that weren't often articulated. Right. And then but you see then like a lot of the Tautomona Aniti connections just become kind of ghost stories for those born in the 20s and 30s, and after the war. But before that, like what you're describing there was clearly the persistence of all these practices connected to the natural world, the spirits, and they were still going on. They were still happening. I mean, but they survived primarily in oral history, and oftentimes what I found is from people witnessing them, but no one discussed them with them what it means, right? Like for example, I found a number of elders, born in the 20s and the 30s, who would describe seeing their like uncles or their dads sort of like if they killed something in the jungle, then they would like say a prayer, but it wasn't to God, it was to like spirits, asking forgiveness and stuff like that. And I'd be like, oh, did he ever teach you to do that? And it was like, no, he didn't, but I always saw him do that. Right. Or if you're going to cut down a tree, you have to apologize, or you have to ask permission to cut down a tree. Like, so what we retain today is asking permission before you go into the jungle. But it's clear that at the start of the 20th century, Chamorros had a much more nuanced connection to their spirits, even if it wasn't as profound as in ancient times. And so when you're describing the issue with the afterbirth, I can see that it was one of those practices that was still around. And so go ahead, dispensa.
I think that's right, Miguel. Let's take the word for placenta. This was something that I didn't even I think even in the dissertation, I didn't have this. I wasn't writing about it. And it was only when it occurred to me, I was wondering, I said, I wonder, because the Chamorro word is on the pares, the more common word for the placenta is pares, Pares, and with the lona over the A, right? Pares. And this was the word that the Patera were using as well. And so even those who didn't practice it, they would allow the family members. So it was practiced. So the word was pares, but then I came across, I happened to look through Pale Ramon de Vera's dictionary, and I was looking up pares, and I saw the word Gatsungi Patkan. That's a really good example of that. We can really think of this as a kind of radical relationality, right? Having, and that, what a big difference that is, right? When you think about pares, which is really the Spanish word, and it's to denote the way the placenta looks like it's cut in half, right? That one half looks just like the other half, and often it's like a tree. It almost, with the veins, it looks like, many people describe it as the tree of life, but one side is equal to the other. In the way that it looks and its shape. And what a big difference. When I first saw that reference, I really got, I had goosebumps, chicken skin, what is like Gatsungi Patgun or Gatsung Patgun, friend of the child. What a big difference from Pares. So this kind of work that you're talking about, our relationships to the land, to the jungle, to nature. That's what's really exciting about the language work. It reveals so much.
Hungan. No, I love that. You're so right, Denencio. To think of that igatsungi neni gatsungi patgun, right? You're so right that it and that's the thing, is that even from that simple word, and then combined with sort of the work that you've done to sort of new scholars can take that and sort of think, what are the cosmological elements to this?
Yeah.
Right. Because that's one thing that we see a lot of times, is that sort of even the words of the Zoamti, the Surahana, a lot of times they are, of course, Spanish derived, and that kind of then cuts us off. But like finding Gatsungi Patgun, it may lead us deeper then to kind of think, well, how would the Chamorro see this? What was their understanding of this prior to sort of the ways that, you know, that came about because of colonization? It's a let me I want to give a chance. Oh yes, so I definitely we've got some questions about Sitan Ogada, and including from your parentesmo, Senora Linda Taitano Regis. And so she wants to know more about sort of what is the insight that you gained from researching Agatha Johnston's sort of manuscripts, her collection, right? Because, you know, for those of you out there, if you have the ability, if you are fortunate enough to have the time and the resources to go to the Micronesian Area Research Center, you know, really look at Agatha Johnston's collection. There's a bunch of collections in the back there. But I remember spending like a day going through sort of the box back there, the photos, even the correspondence, the letters that she had written with people. And so, you know, Agatha Johnston is a very important person in Guam history. But I think you have done, you know, quite a bit in terms of deepening our understanding of her as a figure. And I acknowledge too that sort of in some ways, I remember that there was a time when, especially when I was a young grad student, where I thought of Agatha Johnston as sort of like a kepua, like she's like a sellout to the Chamorro people, because she was focusing so much on Americanizing the Chamorro people, right? And there's that famous quote from her: "I'm an American by choice, you know, a Guamanian by birth," and stuff like that. And so your work really helped deepen my understanding of her and how she saw herself, and you know. But then that really helped me in general see that generation in a very different way. You know, not see them as like, oh, you know, they gave up the Chamorro cause to become Americans. You know, that was early 20s Maget. But so can you tell us more about Agatha Johnston?
Yes. So I'm trying to also think about that specific question. Linda, thank you for that. The about what the unpublished writings give us, I think, is the gist of Linda's question, right? It's Tanagata is just such a dynamic. One thing that I remember someone saying to me was, a very prominent leader in the early 2000s saying, "I never heard anything bad about Tanagata." And I don't think I've ever heard that said about anybody, because usually there was always sort of a dig at, you know, at people, right? They did this, but truly, I had heard that, you know, that you know, in history that, you know, and I believe this was Robert Underwood who shared this, and I hope he doesn't mind that I'm sharing that. But he said, you know, one thing about Tanagata, because I was asking him, Dr. Underwood had actually written that the eulogy for Tanagata, and was saying, you know, when you all in all his dealings, had never heard anything bad said about Tanagata. And I described her in the chapter as having what some may understand to be someone with a corazon faja, you know, it's an old term, right? Really good person, good natured. And it's what I learned from the unpublished writings was ambivalence, and that's a big deal when you think about the story of Tanagata, because much of the conventional historiography is always so self-assured that, I mean, she was patriotic, and you know, that's it. And I think, I mean, we cannot deny that she had strong patriotism to America. So there's no denying of that. but there's another side to that story. And in her unpublished writings, I mean, she was, she's sharing ambivalence about, conveying ambivalence about the land and how much land the military was taking. And as someone who grew up on the Lansu, spent a lot of time on the Lansu, really lamenting how a lot of the rich, fertile land, right, recognizing that the land that, and there's a wonderful thing that she has about observing the bulldozer and comparing it to the focinhos. And I thought that was really profound, right? The bulldozer that just, bulldozes, right, but just clears the land, destructs, devastates, and desecrates, and builds the airstrips. And she's reflecting on growing up on the Lanzo and thinking about the space and the social space that things like the focinhos were carving out, right? And, working the land into that social space and those relationships that were foremost to Chamoros at the time. Excuse me. She was, one of the things that I really got to from the writings was her this ambivalence about the language. Well, not ambivalence. She was very, and I think it was, I interpret it as Agatha Johnston and others like her who could not have fathomed that being modern or flirting with America would mean giving up your Chamorro-ness, right? Being your Chamorro by birth, right? Giving up that identity as Chamorro by birth. And when it became evident, she began to take a more prominent role in that. There's these wonderful exchanges between her and Dr. Underwood, and her participation in the language conference. And here's a moment where she's expressing the importance of children, how important it was in thinking about the relationship between Putgun and Saina, children and grandparents. Language was really key. And this is a moment that really challenges this, the perception that people like Tanagata were simply assimilated. Early on, she shares one-on-one conversations with Governor Dorn, and Governor Dorn has this quote about, look at Tanagata, you want to be like Tanagata, and this idea that, you give up Chamorro and you learn English and learn it well, assimilate, end of story. And here's a moment where it really disrupts that story, that very conventional story.
Sidus Masi for that. I mean, I think that's a very important lesson for anybody who's doing this type of historical work, is that, ultimately at the end of the day, we want to understand our mañana sort of as humans. We may want them to just be sort of greater than life heroes, that they, that this or that, but ultimately we want them to be we want them to be human, complicated, right? And so that's why, when you think about people like, Tanagata, Kiko Suilo, Francisco Bazaleon Guerrero, the late Carlos Titano, Speaker Carlos Titano, these were people who, who were navigating, trying to figure out a way ahead for a people when, when there was opportunities. They had been denied opportunities as a people for so long, and there were opportunities, but there weren't, they didn't have complete freedom, right? They didn't get to pick the school system that they wanted. They didn't actually get to design a school system that they wanted. They didn't actually get to pick the political status that they would want, right? But they were doing their best to try to take advantage of the moment, the historical moment, the change in the colonial guard, to get more for their people. And so, yeah, your work absolutely, really helped me understand that in the case of Tanagata, just sort of as somebody who had very complicated feelings about what was happening, and that may not have even kind of envisioned, like you said, the what might happen, right? Because you're so right, people in that generation never imagined that Chamorro would disappear. But they started to hear its silencing within their own lives.
Yeah. One of the other things one of the things that I was very conscious of is changing the narrative, and um the stories we hear about Tanagata and George Tweed, for example. Tanagata helped George Tweed survive the Japanese occupation, she and other Chamorros. But what again, the unpublished manuscript, the unpublished, her writings, what was called her Tamarita notes that would end up going to a larger piece of writing. But they were just one pages, one page. I don't know if you've had the chance to look at her collection, but oftentimes they were just a single page, reminiscing about certain events, or at a particular time in history, pre-war history. And so she's reminiscing about, talking about George Tweed. And I'm forgetting exactly what it was called. In her handwritten notes, I believe she had betrayed by Tweed, but it gets scratched out, because that's the narrative that we America doesn't want us to hear, right? He's a hero, but in those unpublished writings, she's really saying, this is not about Tweed, this is about my husband, and what Tweed represented, which was the flag. And at the moment, the flag represented this for us. um, and she also talked about how, in her decision to help Tweed, she really struggled because she worried about um, about BJ Bordallo. She also worried about um, si Tunartero, si Tun
Tun Antonio, Tun
okay,
Antonio
okay.
Otero.
Tun Antonio Otero. She worried about those two, and here's an example of why why the Manyetlu relationships are so crucial. And this is what I wanted to also show, is that in their role as patera or educator, as magahaga or matlina, um, that what really figured prominently were Manyetlu relationships. And here's an example of Tanagata very concerned about what could happen to either of them if she had um, Antonio, who was harboring Tweed right up in his property up in the north, but then also worrying about BJ Bordallo, Tun BJ's family, and about how many kids he had, how many children he had. So yeah, that gives us another side of the story.
Oh wow, Biba Sidus Masi for that. And I wanted to share real quick. And so I put this link into the comments on the Fanachu live stream page on Facebook. But this is, of course, Placental Politics. This is the page on Amazon. You can get a copy of it. Oh, it's not showing up. There, where is it? There it is. This is Hadzinanyas. Is this Anan Zamora? Is this
Okay.
yes. Oh man.
Si Tanana Rios Zamora.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so please support. I mean, always remember, look, if you to elevate Chamorros, let's support Chamorros, right? If you want more Guam books and Chamorro books, then buy Guam books and Chamorro books and support Chamorro authors. And so the link to the page is in the comments. But we do have one more question. And Fanachu is usually an hour, but we can go over time if you're okay with that.
Oh, I'm good. Yeah.
Okay, because but it is a very important question, because placental politics, a lot of people in the United States and its territories are thinking about placental politics in the light of Roe v. Wade being overturned. right? They're thinking about issues of abortion, pro-choice, pro-life, anti-choice, reproductive rights, and so on. And so we have somebody asking this question who's very familiar to do, Gabby Diaz. And so she basically, she wants to know, she says, pro-life, pro-choice, it's outdated. These are essentialist sort of ways of thinking about this issue, and they're very problematic when talking about indigenous women and reproductive justice struggles. And so can you speak on the intervention that Placental Politics brings to the table as it relates to ongoing struggles involving indigenous bodies, indigenous community, family well-being and care, but also state control over indigenous communities? And so if you don't mind, I know that there's a lot there, and feel free to sort of take it however you can, but it is a very good question. Sidzus Masigawi.
Again, Sidzus Masi, Gabby. Always love these questions from those girls. So, I think the intervention really is, let me, something I wanted to explain. Placental politics it was a theory. It's a theory and a practice, and it draws from literally the midwives bearing the baby, but it became also, it's also a metaphor for thinking about, it's a metaphor and it's a way of thinking about the broader work and what I call embodied land work of Chamorro women before the war. So embodied, visceral. And I was wanting to really get to this idea of the work that women were doing under colonialism, the work that they were doing that centered stewarding land and bodies. And so literally, right, quite literally, the bearing of the placenta, but also figuratively thinking about ways that Chamorro women stewarded land and bodies. And that's the story of Tanagata, when she, for example, intervenes in a moment where they're sending a woman who was accused of prostitution after the war. And so she intervenes and approaches the Navy governor, but also a Chamorro priest. So stewarding lands and bodies. But placental politics for me was also about I was also beginning to think more broadly about, sovereignty, indigenous forms of sovereignty, the right to self-determine, and the right to say, I'm going to bury my baby's placenta, or I'm going to allow the families to do so, for what that means. It was also beginning to imagine a broader project of rematriation. What's happening now in indigenous communities is bringing the feminine back to land, and what's sacred about land, and struggles to protect that. But also part of protecting the land and bringing the sacred is also the struggles around traditional forms of childbirthing, but not just childbirthing. I mean, I mentioned this in the book too. Midwives didn't just deliver children; they also advised women and their partners on matters around reproductive health and what we understand to be reproductive justice, the human rights of people to really control the terms of their own body. So I think, so I'd like to believe that placental politics, that it's what it comes to stand for more broadly is not only the right to take home our baby's placenta. I wasn't able to do it. Even the year that Hawaii was the first state to pass legislation that allowed families to take home the placenta. So not only allowing that, but also dictating how we, whether we want to be how we want to control our bodies, whether we want to be parents, whether women want to become pregnant and give birth, and in the event that they are pregnant, whether they choose and how they choose to safely terminate those pregnancies. Because we know from the history, and I know a lot of us here have talked about this, but there are the medicines. I won't, I'm not trying to imply that this is something that the Suruhana and the Zoamti all do, but we know that historically women have controlled their bodies, and they have resorted to Amut Samoro and other forms of other kinds of practices to terminate their pregnancies, and ways, different forms of birth control. So I think it comes to stand for broader ways of controlling our bodies, but controlling our lands, because many Native feminists have continued to insist that when you wage violence on the land, you wage violence on women's bodies. When you wage violence on women's bodies, you're also waging violence on the land. And these are you can't separate that. You can't separate the struggles to protect those rights around land.
Again, thank you so much for making that connection, because I think between sort of the respect, I think it was, and what I love about how you phrased it now, right, is I think that this is something that ancient Chamoros believed in, at least in my interpretation from what we know, right, is that is just sort of that connection, right, that if, that because the Spanish, the Spanish write almost mockingly, right, that families fight over issues related to women, right, that's what something that can make people go to war is an issue involving a woman, right? And the Spanish kind of say it like that's ridiculous, but in a sense, when you put all of the mentions of that together, it almost seems like actually it's protection of women. It's like a woman who has been wronged and a family has to protect her, right? That a woman says that a husband has mistreated her. And so the family has to kind of step in to protect her, right? And that a woman's word is believed, right? That a woman doesn't have to fight to be believed. A woman's word matters more than a man's, because a woman is seen as sort of the more essential component in life than the husband or the father, and so on. And so I think that what you described there is that relationship between sort of the female bodies and the land, sort of that you do violence to one, you harm the other, and so on. I think Chamorros understood too that if you respect one, you also can help respect the other, because Chamorro women decided sort of the distribution and the use of land, at least according to some of the Spanish accounts. So you can see a definitely sort of like a cultural, cosmological, genealogical connection between all these elements that you're putting together, and that's what I think it's important as we're talking about culture, that culture for some of us is really sort of just like the last 100 years or so, but there are also these roots, sort of these ancient roots, especially around women and the role of women. And I think it's also good to bring those into the discussion too, right? About what is the role? What kind of where does Chamorro culture stand on these issues? And so I know. Oh, go ahead, Dispensa.
Yeah, no, we could even think of it if we're gonna more and more we are learning our histories, and the oral histories, and oral traditions, and I don't like to make hard and fast distinctions between the two, but take for example our very perhaps the most famous prominent oral history around the origin story, Puntan and Fortna. If and we take seriously those oral traditions, that land is already that is our ancestor. So violence on the land is violence against our ancestor. Puntan, body parts used to make parts of the universe, and also the land, and also Fortna throwing herself upon the land, and Chamorros originating from Fortna's body, right? So yeah.
Sidus Masi. I wanted to give you a chance just to sort of share any final thoughts that you had or final words, whether to people in general or especially if you wanted to say something to like grad students, people who want to study these types of things, but just wanted to give you a chance to offer some concluding thoughts.
I think, one of the things, let me see if I have time to show this.
Sige, Nay. Sige. Hanggang.
Okay, so we can share this.
Oh, yes, por favor.
Okay, let me. I wanted to share this image of, can you see this one image of,
Hanggang, Nay. Can
yeah,
see.
this one
Oh, there we
image.
go. There we go.
That question that Gabby had asked about how I see this intervention of placental politics. And I mentioned these early Chamoru histories of women having sovereignty over their bodies, but whoops, just the sort of contemporary, for me, as I was saying, that what placental politics has come to stand for me now, and not that I wasn't thinking about this when I was writing the book, but this is like a whole other book, right? Thinking about struggles now, and how the earlier history can inform struggles, sovereignty struggles, decolonization struggles for Chamorros, for Guam. Just really becoming more involved in these struggles, these broader struggles that involve not only Chamorros and things back in Guam for me, but also more broadly indigenous rights. I wanted to share this as a way to end. Placental politics is also, I think, for me, also comes is about the past and the present, but also beginning to think about indigenous futurities. And futurities might come off as a very jargony word, but contra futures, right? Futurities is really enacting the futures now. And I like to think that, the struggle is not just about me and my elders. Very key here. I mean, I'm always constantly checking in with my mother about things, but it's also about trying to imagine the future for not just the next generation, the generations to come. What I've learned from American Indians here in Minnesota is thinking about the 7 generations, the ones 3 generations back now and 3 generations ahead, and trying to imagine that. And I think about what might be good for me now might not necessarily be good for the next 3 generations. And so here I'm just sharing an image of the only one that's missing is Eva, our youngest girl, but my 2 girls, our 2 girls and our granddaughter, Maria Sol, at the Fanogi, Guahan, the Fanogi March in 2019, but also sharing a letter that we had submitted, written testimony in opposition to the Heartbeat Act that was introduced when I was back home. And all of us signing this. So different generations as grandmothers, mothers, daughters, and granddaughters. So I wanted to end on that note.
Sidus Masi. Oh, Sidus Masi. I think, no, that's such an important point. The intergenerational sort of transmission of knowledge. You've done it. You've talked about it in a scholarly sense, through oral history, through archival research, sort of the academic passing on of knowledge. But I love the image there of you and your family too, the letter with different generations signing, reminding that sort of the cause of justice sort of critical thinking. These are also passing on of values, preparing the next generation for the fight. These are also sort of a part of that too. And so, Sidzus Masi Tatlu, Tina.
Yeah, thank you so much, Miguel.
Thank you so much. And so, para hamzu todos, ni umeegad and umeekangok Sidzus Masi Tatlu esti fanakpo an otro na episode. Fanatsu, adios, este ki manat lihit